I mean, I think I've talked to politicians, honest politicians who blame politicians. I've talked to journalists, honest journalists who blame journalists but I frankly blame scientists. Because I think, and people in public health, I think systematically created an environment where the kind of conversation you're calling for, which is absolutely reasonable, could not happen. And I'll just give you one incident from my own experience during the pandemic. So I wrote a document called the Great Barrington Declaration, which maybe we'll talk about a little later, but the argument was focused protection of older people and lifting lockdowns. I wrote it, and tens of thousands of doctors and epidemiologists signed on. 4 days after we wrote this document, it had already spread virally because it was basically the old pandemic plan that almost everybody before 2020 understood was the right way to deal with the pandemic. The head of the National Institute of Health in the United States, a man named Francis Collins, wrote to Tony Fauci, the head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, the famous Tony Fauci. Yes. And he called.
Can I just interrupt? That's the Francis Collins of the genome sequencing, human genome sequencing fame.
Yes.
So one of the most respected scientists in the world.
That's correct. Probably the man that was most responsible for the Human Genome Project, and the head of the National Institute of Health. So, a man with a lot of prominence, a lot of power. He sits on top of $40 billion of federal funding. $40 billion of federal funding of scientists, and not just power in terms of money, but in terms of the social status of scientists, so that if you don't get an NIH grant, you can't get tenure at a top medical school. So I have a tenure at Stanford University. I had to get NIH grants to get that funding. So he wrote an email to Tony Fauci calling me, Sunetra Gupta, who's a fantastic epidemiologist at Oxford University, and Martin Kulldorff, another fantastic epidemiologist at Harvard University, Stanford, Harvard, Oxford. He called the three of us, the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration, fringe epidemiologists. And then he called for a devastating takedown of the premises of this. I started getting calls from newspapers asking me why I wanted to let the virus rip, why I wanted to kill grandma, what was wrong with me, what would possess me to go against the scientific consensus on lockdowns, which I knew did not actually exist. I knew, and you could see it from the Great Barrington Declaration, tens of thousands of very prominent scientists, including Nobel Prize winners, signed on to this. The public health authorities on the top of these bureaucracies created an illusion of consensus in favor of lockdowns that did not actually exist. And when you have that illusion of consensus, politicians were helpless. They were helpless to push back, unless you were an extraordinary politician like someone like Ron DeSantis in Florida. You had politicians that said, well, I want to follow the science. Well, they look at Tony Fauci, they say, oh, I'm following the science. But Tony Fauci and Francis Collins and many other people in scientific bureaucracies around the world use their power over the voices of other scientists to create an illusion of consensus, to silence those voices in favor of their policy. And I think they fooled the politician class, and I think they fooled the journalist class.
So I want to agree with much of what Jay is saying there about science. I certainly felt this in the economics profession here in Australia. In fact, the things you're saying, people writing to me saying, why do you want to let it rip? Why do you want to kill grandma? And in fact, somebody on ABC Q&A saying, how can you say that? When I was saying something about, well, how many other people have died from other things during this period, or yes, we are going to have to accept some deaths from COVID, and that kind of perversion of what it means to be a scientist. A scientist is not somebody who simply stands for whatever the main power and money interests say is the right thing. That is not what science. And science is also not fixed. Right? So our understanding of this disease and of how to treat it, how to combat it, has evolved, of course, as the disease has evolved, of course, right, over the last 2.5 years. And a scientist, a true scientist, keeps looking at those data and updating his or her estimates of what's going on, doesn't stay tethered to the same completely erroneous epidemiological models, which left out huge amounts of things that were going on in the real world to deliver these very scary estimates. But instead, is humble and realizes that no model is perfect. And so there was a huge failure in science. In economics, certainly, the word fringe also got applied to me. and a handful of other economists in Australia who did put their heads up above the parapet. And really, it's something that is a broad problem within science itself. We have a bit of a self-licking ice cream cone problem in science now, right? Where you have people who happen to be first past the post in a particular field, publishing a particular article. And in the case of COVID, it was Neil Ferguson and his mates, and a few others who were of that ilk. And they just lock in on this is the right thing to think, this is the right way to think about this problem, and anybody who comes along later trying to get their articles published faces a wall of editors and referees who are biased in favor of what has already been published in a supposedly high-ranking journal. And so you end up having the perpetuation of bad ideas for a long time and the suppression of dissent. And so this is a big problem, not just in health and economics, but I think throughout the social sciences and the hard sciences to an extent. And it's something we talk about in my co-authored book of last year, The Great COVID Panic, with Paul Freiters and Michael Baker. And actually that was published by the Brownstone Institute, which is where Jay and I first met back a few months ago. We were both over there in Connecticut and having a think about all errors COVID policy. And so, that is something we're going to have to clean up in our own backyards. And I think this is one of the things coming out of the COVID period. We're all going to have to take responsibility for remedying some of the systemic problems that have fed into the disasters that have afflicted us during this period.